Ms. Camacho, are we recording? Thank you. Good morning. It is 11:05 a.m. Today is September the 15th, 2022. This is a meeting of the Assembly Enterprise Utility Oversight Committee of the Whole, and I would like to call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Ms. Allard, Mr. Constant,
Here.
Mr. Cross, Mr. Dunbar,
Here.
Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Perez-Verdilla, Mr. Peterson,
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera,
Present.
Mr. Salt,
Here.
Mr. Voland, and Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we have a quorum. Next, on the agenda, we have under unfinished business, continued discussion of Port of Alaska Plan of Finance and discussion of the Eklutna River project. And under new business, a discussion of AR 2022-262, which was introduced onto the agenda for the meeting last Tuesday and continued to the meeting on the 25th of September. Are there any other items members would like to put on the agenda? Hearing none, that's the agenda that we'll proceed with. Briefly, a discussion of the Port of Alaska. Is there anyone here from the port? Okay, there isn't. So I have, and Ms. Zalatel, at the end of the meeting last time, we're committed to meeting with the acting CFO to continue the discussion about the port plan of finance, and we were to come back to the meeting today and brief you on that conversation. But it turns out that the CFO was unavailable for the duration and will be back this week. And Ms. Zalatel and I are scheduled to meet with her next week, or him next week. And so with that, this item, we're just going to continue into the unfinished business section until we have a good sense of where we are. A number of folks have had meetings with both of the key operators at the port, Matson and Tote. And I understand that the Port Commission is taking up the question of the tariff for the next phase of the port modernization program soon, within the next week or so. And then that item will come to us, and I believe the determination of that is an up or down vote. But there are still some contentions around that. I'm looking forward to a briefing at some point soon from the Port of Alaska users group that was established. We'd like to hear from them in context of the tariff proposal that's coming after the Port Commission. So I will be inviting members of the Port Alaska user group to be participating with us at our next meeting next month as well. So with that, I don't have any other specific port items. Any members have questions? And for the record, Ms. LaFrance has just arrived. So I'm hearing none at this point. Ms. Zalatel, anyone on the phone?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Ms. Alto. I don't have any other port-related items. However, I think we should flag for members that the tariff issue might also require a work session.
Yeah, absolutely. Once the item is moved through the Port Commission, we will establish a thorough process for vetting the proposed tariff. And so that will include an additional meeting of this committee, probably a work session, maybe more. And it could be a joint meeting or some kind of joint work session with the user group. I'm not sure the specifics. You and I, after we meet with the CFO, will take the opportunity to scope that out. Anyone else? All right, well then that concludes item A on the agenda, our 3A. And next, let's move into a discussion of the Eklutna River Restoration Project. Is there anyone here from Eklutna or from the other parties that are not inside of the owners group? Yeah. What's your name? Eric Booten from Trout Unlimited is here for this conversation. So this conversation was not intended to be an additional briefing by the owners group. This was a follow-on of the conversation from last month, which was an earnest conversation with the tribe, with the corporation, and with the other stakeholders that just took up more time than we had. but it stays on the agenda in the sense that the conversation wasn't done. And then, of course, I drafted and introduced a resolution that got much fanfare from various parties, and was delayed. I have a series of amendments proposed by the legal department, Department of Law, that are not before us today. And I anticipate that we will be having an executive session. We didn't do it at Tuesday night's meeting just because we didn't know how time was going to work. That meeting could have gone until midnight, and we wanted to make sure we had time for the key business that was on the agenda. So whether that's at a special meeting in the near future or at another regular meeting, to be determined, but the purpose of that executive session will be to have what I have been told is called an owner's perspective briefing on the project. Some parties believe that it will change the assembly's mind on how we look at this project if we hear that briefing. So with that, I think I will introduce Mr. Bowman. Mr. Bowman, you and I had discussed potential alternative language that could be substituted into this resolution, and that conversation kind of talked around, didn't have very much specifics on legal issues and potential data, scientific issues, and other matters. And so let's just use this opportunity to begin the briefing of the members on matters that we can talk in public.
Certainly, and thank you, Assemblyperson Constant. Through the chair to the body, we've been working on scoping this resolution and reworking it. Even before this resolution was proposed, we were trying to set up an executive session with the Assembly on this matter because we are coming up to the release of the Year 2 study data for the Eklutna 1991 Fish and Wildlife Agreement, which is a agreement that the MOA, Chugach, and MEA are party to. It was how we got the dam in the Eklutna project. The MOA is still retains a portion of ownership in the dam, and we wanted to give a executive session legal update so that we have some new assembly members, bring them up to speed on what the MOA's legal obligations and the legal situation out at the dam is, as well as the requirements of the 1991 agreement and the results of the scientific studies which are required under the 1991 agreement, which will eventually lead to a mitigation plan, which will be presented to the governor, and how that's been going so far. So we're right at a nexus point. In the next month or so, we'll be putting out the Year 2 study results for the public consumption, but we wanted to give y'all we're one of the owners, so we need to make sure that everyone has that data and can think about it from an owner's perspective in advance. So Assemblyperson Constant has very kindly delayed this resolution until such time, which we expect to be, if not the next meeting, then no later than the October 11th meeting, to put out some form of a resolution, but so that we have time to give that briefing and get everybody up to speed on where the project is and what's going on.
So do you want to proceed with that briefing as much as you can? Anyone?
Well, for right now, we can't get into the Year 2 study data because that's not publicly released yet. That's going to be a large bit of the meat of it. And in discussion of the legal obligations, other than the fact that I have to do this at a 40,000 foot level.
That's
but
fine.
The 1991 agreement requires that there is a agreement which was put in place, which takes the place of the FERC regulatory process, which would usually be how a federal project is evaluated. The FERC regulatory process didn't take place on the Eklutna hydropower dam because of the time and history in which it was undertaken. The obligation to do that study and evaluation was put on the owners group when we bought the dam. And it's through this contract instead of through the federal laws because of the oddity of the project. Basically, that the feds built it before FERC was quite a settled process, and now we're catching up. So we have to study the impacts of the Eklutna hydropower project and propose mitigation measures for fish and wildlife in and around the Eklutna area impacted by the Eklutna hydropower project. We conduct the scientific studies, which aren't just biological, hydrological, geological studies, but also include such things as local archaeology and anthropology to identify sensitive archaeological resources in the area. And we've been coordinating with the native village of Eklutna throughout this process to help identify and the sites.
So just one sec, Mr. Dunbar has a question.
Please. Once we've compiled all those studies, the owners group is required to put together a mitigation plan or a series of options of a mitigation plan, which will then be presented to the governor. And the governor makes a choice based on multiple factors of that he has to consider, and then tells us what we need to do to mitigate the impacts of the Eklutna hydropower project.
Mr. Dunbar.
I think that's all well and good, and I am fine with us delaying passing the resolution for a couple of weeks or a month even. But I kind of, and I appreciate Mr. Bowman's presentation so far as there might be members who are new to this and haven't been sort of briefed on how we got here in the first place. But I think what it leaves out, in fact, the reason we're doing the resolution at all is that there is a political context here aside from just the strict legal context. It goes back many years, and this body has made a commitment that we want to restore this watershed. And indeed, when we were selling MLMP, we spoke with folks like the former CEO of Chugach Electric, and they committed to performing these studies ahead of the legal schedule. We have a sort of legal mandated schedule, but all of this work we are doing is trying to push that faster because we know that it's a very long timeline. And so far, Chugach, I think, to their credit, they have fulfilled that prior CEO's promise, at least insofar as they conducted the initial studies ahead of schedule. And so I don't want that sort of context to be lost about why we need a resolution like this. If we all just sat back and let the legal process play out how it's mandated back in the 90s before Eklutna was even allowed to be at the table, then this will go forward at some point, but it'll be many years further than many of us want to see this accomplished. So I guess I'm not disagreeing with anything you just said, Mr. Bowman, but none of it to me is a good reason for us not to pass this resolution immediately. Now, if you were saying there's some data we want to see, we're going to do an executive session, and then we're going to come back to this, I guess I'm comfortable with that because this is a multi-year process, and a couple of weeks delay or a month's delay isn't the end of the world, and we're all, I think, hopefully still working in good faith to the goal, whether it is legally mandated or not, towards the goal of restoring the Eklutna River, because it is not just a legal question. It is an ecological, a moral, an ethical, and a political question. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Assemblyperson Dunbar, for that clarification. And I do want to, we are ahead of schedule. We are ahead of the study schedule. We'll be able to present the findings in advance of the legally mandated schedule. The other thing we've done that is beyond what is required is the owners group we have a very strict set of signatories who have to sign off on the 1991 agreement. And as you noted, Assemblyperson Dunbar, Native Village of Eklutna was not included in that group, but the owners group has made an independent commitment that Native Village of Eklutna gets an enhanced role at the table. We can't make them a signatory to the contract. It's a federal contract. It's kind of beyond our exact control, but Native Village of Eklutna is getting a greater degree of involvement. They're getting advance notifications on where things are going, and we're trying to keep them as heavily involved and keep their perspective involved as throughout the whole process.
Anyone else? So, in the conversations back and forth, there has been some, let's just say, stickiness to the use of the term restoration. And so I anticipate we will be having some pretty thoughtful conversations about what does that word mean in the context of A, that which we can do something about, and B, the parties and other factors that we don't have any control over, like highways and train bridges. And so I look forward to the conversation. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to raise question or make comment. For my part, actually, I see now Ms. Quinn Davidson is in the queue. Please, Ms.
Thank you,
Quinn
Mr.
Davidson.
Chair. Yeah, go ahead. I will go ahead. And thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I think Mr. Dunbar really laid out well what the issue is. What Mr. Bowman presented, we've been talking about literally for years, and there's opportunities to speed this up and to do things that will restore a flow to the river earlier. And so we either, as a government who has an interest in this, have an opportunity to work with the tribe and with the local people to restore the river, or sit around and wait. And my preference is definitely the former. And I look forward to the executive session, but I don't think, I'm a little concerned this is just a delay tactic because it feels very similar to what has happened in the past. So can you remind me again, Mr. Chair, when the executive session will be?
So we haven't set the exact date and time. The moving part is there is this carrot on a stick of the completion of a data set that is going to be released. And so I understand that might be ready for the executive session briefing. So again, we were going to do it last Tuesday, but the agenda just got really difficult to manage. And so instead we delayed. So I think that I could probably work with the chair and we could find an hour or an hour and a half for a special meeting in which we can bring all the parties together. And she's nodding. So
And
the answer
may I
is,
ask, Mr. Chair, did we postpone it to September 27th meeting? I'm forgetting at the moment.
the resolution, yes.
Yeah, okay, so it would be sometime between now and then. As long as I'm out of town, so if I can just call in, that would be great, but we can coordinate that offline.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I think that our calendar is kind of full, but I think that there was some availability on the 23rd, but there were some members unavailable that day. And so I'll discuss the finalized kind of opportunity with the chair, and we'll get that nailed down as soon as we can. So do you yield back the floor then? I'll take that as a yes.
You speaking to me, Mr. Chair?
Say again? Yeah, that's to you. Are you done?
Were you speaking to me? Oh, yeah, thank
Okay,
you. Of course,
great.
go ahead.
Thanks. So, and I will pile on with what Mr. Dunbar said and what Ms. Quinn Davidson also pointed to, but I'm going to say it a little bit differently. Mr. Dunbar said that there's a political dimension to this. And I am going to suggest that while the political side is, I think, de minimis relatively, there is a human side, there's an equity side, and there's a justice side of this that demands that we do something and not delay. And so the politics are part of it, but it's that there is a human culture suffering for loss of an asset that they didn't give willingly. And we are in a position to do something about restoring. And so we will have a task to make sure that we come up with definitions of terms that the parties can all agree with, that we can honor the municipality's commitments under the agreement, and at the same time do what we do, which is speak clearly the policy of this municipality. So with that, I think we'll just go ahead and adjourn this item. Probably going to be a pretty brief meeting, and move on to the next section of the agenda. If there's any updates on the stormwater utility, we know there isn't. This administration is not moving forward with that item. We're not removing it from our agenda because the utility is created, and eventually we'll have leadership that supports it. Mr. Dunbar.
I speak to this. I want to express continued frustration and disappointment that this administration refuses to go forward with a stormwater utility. We had a great affordable housing work session with a variety of folks, including many developers, last week on Friday. And the developers, one of the things they asked us for was stop forcing development, infrastructure development onto private construction projects. And the stormwater utility is one way to get better infrastructure built so that you can have more affordable private development. That's why it was a suggestion brought to us by people at Dowell and other private entities, as well as the AEDC a number of years ago. This is a pro-development project, potential utility that has worked in thousands of other communities, and it is deeply disappointing that for political reasons, this administration refuses to consider it or move forward. Thank you, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair. Apologies.
Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question about the stormwater utility, which is, I believe there were funds appropriated to create it or to get community feedback on not its creation, but how it could be stood up further and to do the startup work for the RCA. And I've lost track, frankly, of where those funds are. Are they still being held? Did they somehow go back somewhere else? So I would really like to know where that money is. And I would like, if it's not going to move forward, kind of a final accounting, so I have a better understanding of how far we got and how much money was spent. Because if the funds are still there, I mean, I, like Mr. Dunbar, want this to move forward and want the work to continue. It wasn't complete. It was still very preliminary, and it feels like the rug was pulled out on something that could have been not only really good for the community, but could have been tailored to the community's needs before it ever really began. Thanks.
Yes, I concur. And in fact, we took out a loan. We financed that. And so we're paying the bills for whatever happened. And so, Ms. Camacho, can you help us figure that out? So we'll have a report back on that for the stormwater update for next month's meeting. And I would just note, thank you, Mr. Bowman, for coming from the 7th floor. But once again, committee meeting is without representation of the executive branch of our government. And so while we do hear that the port is an important project to them, and other than the CFO, who we knew who was traveling, there's a whole swath of individuals who could have participated in this meeting, but chose not to. And so just this room is without representation of the 8th floor. So the record clearly reflects it. Mr. Dunbar.
Mr. Chair. Oh,
Yep. Okay, I have.
just to follow up on,
Go ahead, Ms. Alatel, and then Ms. LaFrance, then Mr. Dunbar.
thanks. I was just wondering if we could request whoever was in charge of administering the stormwater utility previously, I don't know if that was through AWU, I can't quite remember, if they could be present as we walk through that accounting next month. Thanks.
Sure. And so what I'm hearing is that we're going to move this item up to new business then. And it would be an update on the stormwater utility development contract with an invitation to AWW. Okay, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note that either last year or earlier this year, the municipal manager had invited me and Mr. Weddleton to continue the conversation about the stormwater utility. I did try to take up that request, but a meeting was never scheduled. It never went forward. And so I wanted to let the other members know that I am definitely interested in continuing or starting that conversation back up. I think it would be good actually with the whole body or in this committee instead of just maybe that initial smaller group, because it is an issue, as you all remember from our discussions about the stormwater utility, of really big concern in District 6, especially with so many road service areas that don't have the ability to coordinate on larger capital projects that impact infrastructure in local areas of road maintenance. Although it's a conversation that needs to proceed. If there's any discussion about that piece in District 6, it needs to proceed in a way where members of those boards are at the table, which is what I thought this initial process would also include with the community outreach. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right, and we established a commission, and the commission at this point is probably terming out here pretty soon with no hope for reappointment until a new administration or this administration opts to change its position. And I would note Mr. Salt has joined us in the room. So it looks like just by virtue of this conversation, the stormwater utility is going to bump itself up again. We'll have that item on the agenda, and we'll make invitations as needed to get that information. Anything else on the topic, Mr. Dunbar?
Actually, my question was a little bit broader, but very much relevant, which is on administration participation in these. This utility hearing is only once a month. And I thought during the reorganization last year, and this is a question for you, Mr. Chair, because you might have a stronger sense of it, that the administration had created a position that was specifically for the management of utilities and enterprises. I believe it was a role filled by Ms. Hickel, Colby Hickel. But then I do not recall if she is still in that role or if she is now in a deputy municipal manager role that is distinct, or she's in deputy manager role that still has that portfolio. And so my question for you is, does that role still exist to your knowledge? And then is there a standing invite to her, if she is the appropriate person, or whoever the person is that has oversight of our utilities and enterprises?
So insofar as I know, what happened, we intended to take a portion of the funding for that position from the utilities, if you don't recall, in the budget process last year, and they said, no, let's not do it that way. Let's do it more general. And so I would suggest that the reality is that individual has broader duties, but still is the individual in charge of the port project, is the individual who's working with the Merrill Field. And so I don't have any knowledge of any other individual that the 8th floor has established as a point of contact. So until further notice, yes, Colby Hickel is the primary point of contact. And so there is and has been a standing invitation. And but for the specific item that we're going to bring up next month, the stormwater, will definitely make an invitation to Mr. Corsatino and Mr. Schimsheimer, who are the ones doing that work. And maybe even an invitation to some members of that commission.
Well, can I suggest that also a invite for all of these always goes to Ms. Hickel? And the reason is because my understanding was, at least last year early, that those individuals at the utilities were reporting to her.
Yes.
And so if they're reporting to her, it makes sense to me that she would be invited whenever any of these topics are on our agenda.
I'm not going to go about inviting them to every specific item based on individual interests and needs. They have a
Sure.
standing invitation to this committee meeting. This is where we monthly discuss matters related to the enterprises and utilities of this municipality. It's not my job to educate them about what's on our agenda, to get them to decide whether or not they want to come. It's their responsibility to come. And so this isn't an afterthought that they can do when they just want something. This is a committee that they should attend to stay up on the business of the municipality and keep us briefed.
Yeah.
So when they have items that are important, they move instead of getting set for another committee meeting a month or two later, which we can anticipate is going to come to us in the package of that tariff for the port. We're going to see it at the last minute, and they're going to tell us the end of the world is coming if you don't pass this today. Right? And we're going to have concerns because that's what we do. We investigate ideas, we push on them. And so, yes, we will reiterate a communication to the executive branch of the government that they are invited and in fact desired to be at these meetings so we can get more out of them. But no, I'm not going to make specific invitations to specific members of the administration to attend these meetings. They should know, in particular, the chief executives. Mr. Salt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's on. Yes, please. Ms. Camacho.
I just want to provide a point of information that your regular reminders that I send out by email for all of the committees also do go to the administration. And so the Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee email goes out to Ms. Domboski, Ms. Hickel, Ms. Christensen, and then all of the utility and enterprise directors. So it does get sent out.
Right. The work is being done. And I would, to the credit of Ms. Christensen and the law, they're here. Thank you. It's, I'm just going to say it at every meeting I'm at where we have important matters of this municipality and no executive branch. It's going on the record that they're here or not. And so, but again, I'm not going to march upstairs and say, are you please coming to our meeting at 11? Please, sir, can I have another? I'm hungry. This is not how this works. But we are going to continue to have these meetings, and it'll be a surprise to them that the stormwater is back on the table. So next item, legislative priorities. I don't know that we have anything. Budget priorities. Again, this committee, we may at some point seek to hire an additional or back a contractor like we did with Sturgielewski, who helped us sort through the port questions as we come upon a time where we have a very complex question coming at us without extensive and thoughtful briefing on the port. But we'll come to that bridge when we get there sometime in October. I don't want to jump the shark on that. So next we will move on to audience participation. We have some members of the public here. If they want to speak, you have 3 minutes. Anyone on the phone, *6 to unmute. Hearing none, it doesn't sound like anyone wishes to participate. And with that, it's a 40-minute meeting. I would take a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned.